Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar put on by Lallemand Brewing, Hefeweizen and Beyond, Mashing and Fermenting for Better Wheat Beers. My name is Eric Abbott. I'm a technical support manager for Lallemand Brewing. I have a background in biochemistry, botany, and worked as a hands-on brewer, and have been with Lallemand Brewing for about 7 years now in various roles from the R&D lab to sales, and now my current role as technical support manager. I'm joined today by Galen Smith. Galen is the Southeast sales manager for Malteurop Malting Company, where he brings valuable expertise and passion to his role. He has a background of many years as a head production brewer in North Carolina, and he made significant career shift to leverage his experience and contribute to the industry as a malt supplier, guided by his commitment to aiding brewers in utilizing malt effectively. So today, for this discussion about wheat beer, we're going to be focusing on the two defining ingredients of wheat beer styles, of course, wheat, but also wheat beer yeast. So Galen will start by speaking about malt selection and mashing for wheat beer styles, and then I will continue to talk about approaches for fermentation to get the most out of your wheat beers. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Galen.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, good morning to some and good evening to others, I'm sure. My name is Galen Smith with Malteurop Malting Company, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on wheat beer production. You know, one thing I think is really cool about wheat beer is the complexity of them. You know, they can be light and refreshing, while at the same time, they can often be very substantial in mouthfeel and body. They can also be clean like an American style wheat, or they can exhibit, spice with esters and phenols found in the European style wheat beers. And as Eric said, for my portion of today's webinar, I will be discussing wheat as a raw material. So some of the slide. So as a raw material, some of the topics we'll be diving into will be different wheat products used in wheat beer production, how they're made and the characteristics and attributes of them. And then we'll discuss some typical wheat beer styles and the wheat products normally used in brewing them. This will bring us into applying this information to the brewing process and some tips and best practices for brewing wheat beers. We'll be ending this with a brief overview of enzymes and process aids that can be used to increase performance and efficiency. Slide. So we're going to start off with malted wheat, as it's the most commonly used wheat product in my opinion. Malted wheat, like malted barley, has been malted, which is to say the kernels have been modified, allowing enzymes to degrade the beta-glucan and non-starch polysaccharides that make up the cell wall, and protease enzymes to reduce the protein matrix within the starch granules. This gives us access to the starches in the mashing process and produce diastase enzymes, FAN, and ferulic acid. Like barley malt, malted wheat must be milled to expose the starchy endosperm. Red and white wheat are common wheats used for malting. The white wheat kernels are closer in size to barley malt, which is a pretty important consideration when milling, and we'll discuss that further in just a bit. Next. Going into raw wheat. So raw wheat obviously is the base material for all wheat products used in brewing. Though not having gone through the malting process, this material is higher in protein and non-starch polysaccharides. Exhibits no diastatic power or FAN, and because it has not been killed, it also has a higher moisture content than its malted counterpart. Similar to malted wheat, this product must be milled to gain access to the endosperm, though the structure of raw wheat is harder than malted wheat and should also be a consideration when selecting wheat products for your beer. Next. Flaked wheat is a pretty unique product that has been used to add body and mouthfeel to beers for ages and has increased in popularity in the past few years as a way to increase haze in New England and hazy IPAs. It's produced by taking raw wheat exposed to extreme heat, which in turn gelatinizes the starches, making it ready for mashing. It's then passed through rollers, which flatten the kernels into flakes. This allows access to the starches without needing to be milled. Similar to raw wheat, it has not been malted, making it higher in protein and non-starch polysaccharides. This is desirable for wheat beer styles where 4VG, 4-vinyl glycol, we'll be referring it to 4VG going forward, should not be expressed. This is also higher moisture content, like raw wheat, which reduces its shelf life somewhat and makes it somewhat attractive to bugs. So consider that when storing rolled wheat and raw wheat. Next. Torrefied wheat is, I think, is really cool. It's a unique product, and it's not often used, but it can add body and in head retention as a specialty wheat product. Like flaked wheat, it's exposed to intense heat, so it's kind of like flaked wheat before it goes through the rollers. It's exposed to intense heat, which in turn puffs it up kind of and increases the kernel size. This exposure to heat also gelatinizes the starches, making it ready for scarification in the mash. Also similar to raw and flaked wheat, this exhibits no DP or fan, so it should be used in lower percentages of the grist. Protein and non-starch polysaccharides are high in this material from lack of malting. However, this material does need to be milled to expose the starches. Okay. So this is kind of a really, really interesting one. It's a relatively new material called crystal wheat. And it's made similar to the way malted, like crystal malt would be made, like crystal barley malt. It's made by taking fully modified green malt. So it's been, germinated, but before it goes to kiln, that green malt is then put through a stewing and crystallization process. And like crystal barley or like crystal barley malts, the endosperm is hard and crystalline in structure rather than mealy starch that is exhibited in base malts. These products can be used as a specialty malt to impart body, flavor, and color, and color when using darker colored crystal malts. Malteurop, we have a unique crystal malt that is very low in color. It's 3-Lovibond, and what this does allows the brewer to use it in much higher percentages of the total grist without changing the color all that much. A lot of brewers have found success using this to aid in colloidal stability, in hazy IPAs, as well as being used in some Belgian styles as well. All right, next. All right, so now we've gone over the types of wheat products used in brewing. So we're going to dive into some common wheat beer styles and typical wheat products used for these styles. So it's important to consider what kind of wheat product to use in regard to the type of wheat beer being made. Some characteristics of different wheat beer products may be undesirable for certain styles where it's desirable for others. German style wheat beer or Hefeweizens, for example, should exhibit banana esters and clove phenolics. Using a non-malted wheat variety won't produce the ferulic acid needed for 4-vinyl glycol production. And for that reason, malted wheat should not be used for that style. Using 50% or more, malted wheat should be used for that style. I was going into Belgian wit. Using 50% more and malted wheat and Hefeweizen is a typical grist percentage, with the other base malt typically being a Pilsen spec malt. And because of the higher percentage of wheat, which has no husk, it is highly advised, to use rice hulls to make the grain bed less dense and conducive for smooth and quick lathering. Belgian style wheat beer, on the other hand, does not typically exhibit clove phenolics from 4VG and is usually made with higher percentage of raw wheat. And because of its unmalted form, a multi-step mash is sometimes advised, and is also recommended to use unmalted wheat for Belgian style beers, is it not going to impart as much color as its kilned cousin. American wheat is pretty similar in grist composition to Hefeweizen. Ferulic acid rest is probably not going to be recommended, just so you don't get those 4VG compounds in the finished beer. And one of the other differentiators, as Eric will touch on in the yeast selection portion of this webinar, is in these styles, it's going to not exhibit the banana and clove esters where it will in Bavarian style wheat and Hefeweizen. And all these styles where wheat is used as a base malt, again, rice hulls should be used to ensure a smooth runoff and general extract recovery. Next. All right, so we're going to go over kind of applying this and using the wheat products in the brewing process for brewing these type of beers. So we'll be talking about milling first. And so, when using wheat for producing wheat beer styles, in the brewing process, it's necessary to mill all products except the flaked wheat. Flaked wheat can be added directly to your mash tun. But when milling other wheat products, kernel size is something to consider because it is a different size from barley malt. So gap adjustments will likely be necessary, though sometimes it is difficult to adjust and then readjust your mill gap for different size kernels. So a lot of the time, and I would advise most people, just to find a happy medium, a gap setting where it's going to, crush your barley malt and your wheat efficiently. And as mentioned earlier, the addition of rice hulls will make your day go by faster by producing a mash that's less dense, allowing increased extract recovery. Also, keeping your barley husks intact is something that should be, you should keep a close eye on. You really want that mash bed to be as less dense as you can get it, right? So keeping those barley husks intact is just going to help that even more. So, don't pulverize your husks with a tight mill gap. If you are able to condition your malt, it is advised to keep those husks intact and pliable. Also, using exogenous enzymes should not be frowned upon as a means to increase ladder times and overall extract recovery. May be necessary to adjust the mass pH to adjust for the slightly higher pH of wheat. And when brewing Hefeweizens, mashing at a lower temperature to favor beta amylase will also produce a wort more rich in glucose, which in turn promotes isoamyl acetate production and fermentation. Next. All right, and we'll end it with a couple process aids and enzymes that are available through Lallemand. Glucanase enzymes to reduce beta glucans and non-starch polysaccharides. This in turn is going to, make your day go by faster. It's going to increase your wort recovery times and also improves finished beer filtration performance, right? So if you are, filtering this beer through some sort of media filtration, it's going to speed that up as well. Don't be afraid to use them. They're wonderful products. Yeast nutrients, also to provide healthy fermentations for wort containing higher percentage of non-malted wheat. It's a great product that should absolutely be used should be considered being used when making beers with non-malted wheat or higher adjunct beers as well. And then protease enzymes to increase soluble protein to promote healthy fermentations and stability. And that covers my portion of this webinar. Thank you again for joining, and I will now hand it off to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. I forgot to mention at the beginning of this webinar that you can ask questions throughout the webinar by using the question button on the side of the Crowdcast screen. And if you see a question that you would particularly like to see answered, feel free to upvote that so we could answer it first. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So going on from malt and into the world of yeast. The wheat beer yeast character tends to be, in many cases, very high in esters, very fruity, especially with a lot of banana character. Wheat beer yeasts will tend to be more phenolic with a spicy character, especially clove. Wheat beer yeast will tend to be low flocculation and contribute to haze, although the haze is a combination of wort composition as well as the flocculation of the yeast. So there is some haze that will come from the, the malt selection and the mashing techniques. 4-vinyl guaiacol, or 4VG, is the clove character that often comes from most wheat beer yeasts. It requires ferulic acid as a precursor, which is derived from the malt. And it also requires that the yeast be POF positive. So POF positive yeast will produce a ferulic acid decarboxylase enzyme that will convert the ferulic acid into 4VG. So yeast strain selection is very important for getting the clove character that you might want in your wheat beers. Isoamyl acetate is an ester that provides a banana character to the beer. It's formed, all esters are formed by combining an alcohol with an acid. In the case of isoamyl acetate, the reaction is between isoamyl alcohol and an acetyl-CoA, which is facilitated by the alcohol acetyltransferase enzyme produced by the yeast. There are at least 90 different esters that have been identified in beer. They provide a floral or fruity and sometimes a solventy character. The characteristics of the esters are dependent on the type of ester, but also on the concentration. The type and the amount of esters produced depend primarily on the choice of yeast. There are other factors that will influence the amount and type of esters produced, including oxygen levels, pitch rate, fermentation temperature, pressure, and wort composition. But the primary factor to consider is the yeast strain. Going into some detail about the different factors influencing ester levels in your wheat beers. Oxygen will inhibit the acyl alcohol transferase enzyme produced by the yeast. This is the enzyme that will take the alcohol and combine it with the organic acid to produce an ester. If you have sufficient wort aeration levels, you will tend to get lower levels of esters. If you don't have enough oxygen in your wort, you may get higher levels of esters. However, under aerating your wort is not necessarily recommended as a method for increasing your ester levels. There's much better ways to do that. Pitch rate will influence the amount of esters produced. Lower pitching rate tends to lead to a lower solvent character from the esters. It leads to lower total ester concentrations, which is primarily by lowering the amount of ethyl acetate, which is the most abundant ester in beer. However, lower pitching rates will lead to an increased perception of fruity character. There's an overall increase in perceived ester character, even though the total ester quantities through ethyl acetate are reduced. This is why we generally say that lowering pitching rate tends to increase esters. It's the perceived esters that are increased in this case. Temperature has a strong influence on ester levels as well. Generally, warmer temperatures will lead to more yeast growth, which will lead to higher levels of fusel alcohols and higher ester levels, because fusel alcohols are a precursor for the esters. Higher temperatures are generally proportional to higher ester levels, but there can be a different effect on different types of esters. Generally, higher temperatures lead to more floral esters than fruity esters. Wort composition has a strong impact on ester levels. Higher zinc levels, high gravity, high fermentability wort, the use of adjuncts and sugars, more trub carryover, and higher fan levels will all generally contribute to higher levels of esters. Pressure will influence production of esters. Pressure is a stress on the yeast that inhibits yeast growth. it will decrease the amount of fusel alcohols produced, which is directly related to the yeast growth, and thereby have an effect on decreasing ester levels as well. Hydrostatic pressure will impart a degree of pressure on the fermentation and will affect the level of esters. So your tank geometry will affect your ester levels as well. A tall tank with a high level of hydrostatic pressure will tend to have lower levels of esters compared to a horizontal tank. Yeast strain selection, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the most important factor when determining the amount of esters produced in your beer, related to the enzyme activity and the specificity of the enzymes produced by the yeast. Wheat beers are generally known for high levels of isoamyl acetate, producing a banana character. I invite you to visit a yeast flavor control module that we have posted online. The website is linked here on the screen, and we'll post that link in the chat as well. We go into a bit more detail about how to control ester levels in wheat beers or other beer styles, as well as other flavor compounds that are influenced by the yeast. At Lallemand, we have a few different strains that we would recommend for producing wheat beers. Munich Classic and Wit are the most traditional wheat beer yeasts, Munich Classic being more German style and Wit being more Belgian style. We also have Farmhouse and the Abbey strain that are excellent options for producing wheat beers, even though they don't come from traditional lineages of traditional wheat beer strains. I'm going to go into some detail in the next slides about some characterization that we've done on these 4 strains with regards to how esters and 4VG levels and fusel alcohol levels will vary depending on the temperature and the pitching rate. Just a brief description before we get started. Munich Classic is a German-style wheat beer yeast, traditionally used for Hefeweizen. Has a very strong banana character, strong clove character, which is ideally for the Hefeweizen styles. Wit tends to have a more muted banana and clove character, which makes it great for Belgian style beers, leaves a little bit more space for you to add spices and other ingredients to Belgian style wheat beer yeasts or wheat beer styles. It also makes it useful for some American style wheat beers that desire a little bit less banana and less clove. The Farmhouse strain is a very interesting strain that we originally selected for production of non-diastaticus saison, so without degrading any dextrins or starches through the STA1 enzyme. We found that fermenting this yeast at lower temperature gives a very nice banana character that is perfect for wheat beer styles. Another very important advantage of the Farmhouse strain is the fact that it will not produce H2S. Farmhouse is a hybrid strain that was developed using parental strains that do not produce H2S because of their genetics. The pathways that lead to production of H2S are not present, so it is genetically not able to produce H2S, which is very important for some wheat beer styles that may have some issues with H2S. If you have issues with H2S in your wheat beers, Farmhouse is an excellent option for addressing those issues. The Abbey strain is another great option, producing a nice banana and clove character, but having a little bit other complex fruity character in addition to the banana. It also has a little bit higher flocculation relative to the traditional wheat beer strains. I put this up here for reference that you can go back to and check later for a comparison of all of these 4 strains. And we also have a document available for download, wheat beer solution and strain selection that you can link to by clicking the green button at the bottom of the Crowdcast screen. So in terms of the temperature and pitch rate influences on these 4 strains, for fusel alcohols are associated with yeast growth, and they are a precursor for ester formation. Higher temperatures tend to lead to higher amounts of fusel alcohols. Higher pitch rates also tend to increase the amount of fusel alcohols. However, since fusel alcohols are a precursor for esters, the enzyme activity of the yeast will, as they produce more esters, will tend to decrease the amount of fusel alcohols. So the effect of these factors on fusel alcohol formation is also influenced by the ester formation, and they're indeed related. Take a moment just to get acquainted with these slides because we'll use the same legend for the next few slides. Lower pitch rate is in orange, higher pitch rate in blue, higher temperature is in the striped lines, and lower temperature is in the solid lines. So you see indeed that higher temperature in the striped lines tends to lead to higher fusel alcohols, and and higher pitch rates, the blue tends to be higher fusels compared to the lower pitch rates. In terms of total esters, lower pitch rate has the strongest effect on increasing the amount of esters. You see that the orange bars tend to be much higher than the blue bars in all cases for all strains. Higher temperatures will also tend to lead to more esters, but to a lesser degree than pitch rate. Focusing in on isoamyl acetate, the banana character, again, lower pitch rate is the dominant factor in increasing the amount of esters in the beer. And again, higher temperature will also increase the amount of esters in the beer, but the effect tends to be a little bit more strain dependent. We see very strong effects in Abbey and Munich Classic with regards to pitch rate, in wit as well, although the levels tend to be in general lower than Munich Classic and Abbey, but there's less effect in farmhouse on the amount of isoamyl acetate. For 4VG, clove character, lower pitch rate will tend to lead to higher levels of 4VG, and this effect is quite pronounced in some cases. For example, the wit strain, where we see lower pitch rates leading to very high levels of 4VG compared to the higher pitch rate. Higher temperature also tends to lead to higher levels of 4VG in most cases, and we see that especially pronounced in the farmhouse strain, where we see when using 0.5 grams per liter as a pitch rate, going from 20 degrees Celsius up to 25 degrees Celsius results in a very strong increase in 4VG levels, whereas at 20 degrees, the 4VG levels are almost not present at all. Just focusing in on these two outliers and highlighting the importance of strain selection and strain-specific effects of these factors like pitch rate and temperature on flavor control. In addition to these 4 strains that we described in a bit more detail, we have a few other yeast strains that I would like to propose for different wheat beer styles. If you're looking for a neutral POF negative character, for example, in many wheat beer, American wheat beer styles, BRY97, Nottingham, and Windsor are excellent options. BRY97 and Nottingham will be higher attenuation, whereas Windsor, being maltotriose negative, will tend to produce a sweeter, more full-bodied wheat beer. Belle Saison is an excellent option as a diastaticus strain for producing very dry and fruity wheat beer styles. New England will also produce a nice fruity character. And I made a mistake in this slide, actually. Belle Saison is indeed POF positive, whereas New England is POF negative. Producing NABLAB, non-alcohol or low-alcohol beers using a maltose negative strain, I would propose using the Lona strain. Lona does not ferment maltose, so it will have very low attenuation and allow you to get in the range of 0.5% alcohol when combined with high temperature mashing methods or lower starting gravity. It's also POF negative, so ideal for American wheat beer styles. In terms of strain selection by beer style, we have a handy table with our strain recommendations for different wheat beers, including some of the darker styles like a Dunkelweizen or the Weizenbock. And this is a handy reference to go back to for strain selection advice in the future. As a quick reference, I won't go into detail about all of these factors. The discussion related to esters, I went into a lot of detail during this presentation and a little bit in terms of 4VG, but we also have some recommendations in terms of how to adjust body and mouthfeel of the beer, as well as the acidity, whether you want to increase or decrease any of these compounds. And this quick reference for sensory control, strain selection by beer style, and other details about wheat beers, we have summarized in a Wheat Beer Solutions Best Practices document, which is available for download using the green button at the bottom of the screen. And I invite you to check that out for more detail about wheat beers. So that's all I have to say. I hope that we have some questions, and I'll take a look at those now. First question, is there a way to emphasize more banana and less clove? So as mentioned in some of the previous slides, both temperature and pitch rate have a strong influence on both esters and clove levels. If you want less clove, I would tend to choose a strain that produces less clove in general, and then focus on conditions to increase the amount of banana. The amount of banana character isoamyl can be increased by using sugars and adjuncts, high fermentability wort, or higher nutrition levels, whereas those will not tend to have the same effect on 4VG. I could also go back to a previous slide. In these two cases, we could see that by optimizing the pitching rate and the temperature, so in this case using 0.5 grams per liter of yeast and fermenting at a lower temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, we tend to get very low levels of 4VG, but the ester levels are still moderate to high in these cases. Moving on to the next question, how to control the pH to be too low. Is it normal to have sour palate in the Hefeweizen? It's not normal to be overly sour, but it is quite common to use things like acidulated malt or sour mash in traditional wheat beer styles as a way to lower the pH a little bit. If you don't want the pH to be too low, you could certainly avoid the use of acidulated malt, and don't use the sour mash, or certainly don't add any acids to the beer. But you can increase the ratio of wheat to reduce the amount of acidity that is imparted to the beer. Moving on to the next question, can you please describe how to increase and stabilize the haziness of the wheat beer? Stable haze is partly a function of the yeast, but most of the stable haze will be a result of the selection of the malt and the types of wheat being used. So Galen, would you like to comment on stable haze?
Yeah, sure. So, I think I may have touched on this earlier, but for, increasing haze stability, um, there, like you said, Eric, it's very largely to do with the wheat selection. Um, so we've had a lot of customers have success with introducing that crystal wheat uh, products into their hazy beers. Um, it does increase the colloidal stability, so it's not going to impart the same type of turbidity that you're going to get with your flaked components and malted oats and things of that nature. But it will help that haze remain stable longer. So, I typically recommend taking the percentage of flaked products that you're using in your mash to impart that haze, and replacing starting with about 20% with that crystal wheat.
Okay, next question. How does open fermentation impact a German Hefeweizen? I'll go back to my slide on pressure effect on esters. In general, the pressure stresses the yeast and inhibits growth, and you tend to get lower levels of esters when fermenting under pressure. If you have an open fermenter, you have no top pressure, so you will tend to have higher levels of esters in an open fermentation. Moving on to the next question. How do I increase foam stability of Hefeweizen as well as haze stability? Um, Foam stability, again, would be largely impacted by the malt selection, so I'll hand that one over to Galen.
Sure. So, increasing foam stability and foam formation in a Hefeweizen, I would definitely, consider adding, a higher proteinaceous material such as flaked wheat or torrefied wheat in there. I was always a big fan of torrefied wheat. I would use it in my IPA actually to develop a little bit more body and head retention. Um, you'll hear people talk about doing a protein rest. Um, I wouldn't advise you do that for foam stability and foam formation. I would lean more towards higher protein material rather than going that route, because you can actually do more harm than good.
Okay. Next question. What is a good pH for more banana flavor in the mash? Um, I'm not really aware of so much about what effect the pH has on the isoamyl acetate levels in the mash. Galen, do you have any comment on that?
I really don't. I would try to keep your mash pH, to what you would normally use, so around 5.4, something like that. But as far as um, to increase more banana flavor, I really don't have much of an opinion on it.
Yeah, I would say to focus more on the other factors for influencing the isoamyl acetate levels. pH adjustment should be more about flavor and mouthfeel. And adding a small amount of acid malt will tend to, many people find that it increases the crisp character and drinkability of a wheat beer. But I don't generally associate pH with an influence on banana character. The next question, what about decoction? Do you recommend? Galen?
I do. Generally speaking, you're gonna get a little bit more rich malt flavor out of it that way. If you have the capabilities to do a decoction mash on your brew house, why wouldn't you do it? It's a good practice, and makes things a little bit more interesting and gives a lot more depth of flavor that way. So for a Hefeweizen, absolutely, yeah.
Now, we had some discussion about decoction in our lager best practices and webinars. And there's some debate. It certainly is traditional for lagers and also for wheat beers. Is it necessary? If you want to use the traditional methods to produce traditional styles, absolutely, you can consider a decoction. Is it necessary? Is it essential? Absolutely not. You could produce excellent wheat beers without decoction. I wouldn't say that you need to, um, that it is a requirement for brewing excellent wheat beers. However, it certainly does impart unique characters through the decoction process and may increase the complexity of flavors. And Galen, would you say you could accomplish something similar just by adjusting your malt selection and your grain bill, even if it involves non-traditional malts?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you touched on that. Is it required? Absolutely not. I mean, step mashing and decoction, if you're using well modified malts, as it's not necessary, but it does add some complexity to it. You could get similar flavors from adding some like a melanoidin malt to your at a low percentage to your total grist. The purists out there who the decoction purists would probably say that they could taste the difference. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. My palate is not defined enough to do that. So I think that you could, yeah, if you don't have decoction capabilities, but you wanted some of those characteristics associated that you get from performing decoction mash, yes, absolutely, you could add some richer melanoidin style malts.
Yeah, I guess in a summary, if you have the ability to do decoction easily, go ahead. It's a great option. It's not the first thing that I would recommend in terms of optimizing your wheat beer flavors. There's many other simpler factors. There's so many factors to consider, and decoction is a complex process. I would approach optimizing other factors first before considering decoction, unless you're already set up to do that. We have a question in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately. Galen, how's your Spanish?
Terrible.
Eric, Galen, I've translated it. He's
Oh, okay.
asking about acid rest and if it's necessary with modified malts.
You want to take that one, Galen?
Sure. Yeah. I would say to release some of the ferulic acid, performing an acid rest, even in well modified malt, yes, it is something that will be beneficial for if you're looking for a final beer with noticeable 4VG levels in it. Yes, I would. Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a good answer. Next question, asking if Lallebrew yeast should be rehydrated and oxygenated. We do not recommend rehydration for Lallemand Brewing yeast. It can be dry pitched directly into the wort without rehydration. We find that there is no significant difference in fermentation performance or flavor when dry pitching. Dry pitching is simpler, easier, and you're with fewer steps. There's going to be more consistency in the process as well. In terms of oxygenation, it is not necessary to aerate your wort when using Lallemand Brewing dry yeast with the first pitch. The reason is because the yeast has sufficient amounts of sterile and unsaturated fatty acids in its cell wall in order to multiply 3 or 4 times in the absence of oxygen. Oxygen would normally be required to for the yeast to make the cell wall components necessary for division. The dry yeast with first pitch, it has sufficient amounts of these compounds to divide without oxygen. Now, there may be some flavor differences related to whether you aerate or not, but those effects are likely to be minimal. And yeah, there are many people many commercial breweries are dry pitching without aeration with great results. Next question, have we benchmarked the ester and phenol data to other similar non-Lallemand strains? We do some benchmarking of other strains, but I don't have data on that to share at this time. Next question, in what styles can the Lona strain be used? So Lona is a maltose negative strain, has very low attenuation in our standard wort. Prepared from dry malt extract, we see between 10 and 20% attenuation. With high temperature mashing, the attenuation can be pushed low enough to achieve 0.5% alcohol or less. The Lona can be used in terms of wheat beers. It tends to be used in American style wheat beers where you don't have very much banana or clove character. It's puff negative and very clean fermenting, very few esters produced. So you could produce a nice wheat beer using this strain, a non-alcohol or low alcohol wheat beer, but it will not have significant levels of esters or phenolics. Next question. Which wheat product emphasizes the best support for the longer lasting head? Red wheat or white wheat? Galen, you touched a bit on head retention already, but in terms of red wheat or type of wheat, do you have a comment?
No, I don't. As far as I know, and that's a very good question, there's not a direct correlation between head retention in red wheat and white wheat. With the head retention, as stated before, a more proteinaceous material is gonna do that for you. So, I think you could probably, use red wheat or white wheat, and it would perform the same for you. But if you wanted to get a little bit more head retention, the addition of flaked or torrefied wheat products would be your best option before you start exploring differences in red and white wheat malt.
Okay. Galen, are you familiar with the Herman method? I am not.
I don't believe I am.
Okay. For questions about the Herman method, I invite you to send me an email at brewing@lallemand.com. We could maybe have that discussion online. Sorry, I can't speak to that right now. The next question, if raw wheat or chit is used in grist, is a protein rest necessary?
Sorry, I was looking up the Herman method. Is raw wheat or chit? Is a protein rest necessary? I wouldn't say that a protein rest is ever totally necessary. And if you're adding, chit malt, like chit barley malt, raw wheat, using the grist, I mean, sure, you could, but it ultimately has to do with what you're trying to achieve by using that product. I mean, if you're trying to get body and, because the chit is going to have higher protein than a well-modified malt, I would say no.
Okay. I have a question about using rice husks. Is it mandatory to use them? It's often recommended for aiding in filtration of the lautering of the wort, and it does not add flavor.
No, it does not add flavor. When I was brewing, the last brewery I worked at, our flagship was a Hefeweizen, so we went through plenty of rice hulls, and I would include the addition of rice hulls directly into the mash, as we're mashing in. Now, I have heard of people rinsing their rice hulls before they use them, so they're tossing them into their mash tun, their mash lauter tun, rinsing them off with some hot liquor and then draining it. I guess the idea there being that, maybe it does add some flavor. I've never noticed any noticeable flavor with the addition of rice husks. Is it mandatory to use rice husks? Are you a glutton for punishment? Because if you don't, it's going to make things pretty difficult for you, especially when you're dealing with a high percentage of wheat products in your mash. The wheat, as we said, It doesn't have husks on its own, and barley husks, depending on how you're milling, can sometimes be pulverized. So, making that grain bed a little bit more fluffy and porous, so that your overall extract recovery as well as ladder speeds are good. Then I would say yes, it is mandatory to use rice husks. If you were to ask me, like, is there a percentage of wheat that you would say, if you go above that certain percentage, would rice hulls need to be added? If I had to say, I would say, 20% and above use rice hulls.
Perfect. A question about farmhouse yeast and banana character. What is the recommended temperature to achieve better banana character? In general, we've noticed more banana character at the lower fermentation range, so around 18 to 20 degrees. However, if we look at the actual graph in terms of banana character for the farmhouse strain, yeah, it seems that in the graphs that there's not a strong influence on either pitch rate or temperature on the amount of isoamyl acetate. However, I do know from field trials that more banana character has been reported at lower temperatures, around 20 degrees. And this could be an issue of the balance of different flavor compounds that may be masking the banana character at higher temperatures, and you just get less of that masking at lower temperatures. Let's take one more question about the banana forward Hefeweizen. For a banana forward Hefeweizen, would I ferment close to the limit of the strain? I assume that means a higher temperature and under pitching by about 60%, combined with under oxygenation. So in general, I wouldn't recommend under aerating your wort. It's not necessary for dry yeast with first pitch, but if you're repitching or using liquid yeast, certainly don't under oxygenate as a means for controlling your ester levels. Generally, for banana forward, I would use Munich Classic. For a traditional Hefeweizen, ferment warmer, around 25 degrees Celsius, and at around 0.5 grams per liter. So for any other additional questions, I would encourage you to send me an email at brewing@lallemand.com. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you everyone for attending. As mentioned, there's a link to download our wheat beer solutions and strain selection best practice document at the bottom of this page. You can also send me an email to get a copy of the slides if you'd like. And this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page within a couple days. So thank you again to everybody, and have a great day.
Yep, thank you.